Welcome, everybody, to our Wednesday night edition of Book Club. Okay, attendance is not as meager as I thought it would be. Thank you for coming. We have some new people here tonight. Adam and Phaedrus. Adam says he does not wish to talk, but I hope he changes his mind. Welcome, regardless.
Hi,
Phaedrus.
thanks for having me.
Who is that?
This is Phaedrus.
Phaedrus, hello. Where are you from?
I'm from New Zealand. It's
Hey.
like 1:43 in the afternoon.
Nice. What's up with New Zealand? We have a bunch of New Zealanders in here somehow.
Really?
Yeah. Grubs dealer. She was just here a second ago. But thanks
For
for
a
coming. What's your
philosophical.
name?
My real name, Mary Jane.
Mary Jane.
Or MJ.
Welcome. Hmm. What do you want? What do you prefer?
I guess MJ because it's like less syllables.
Eh, love it. MJ. Yeah, welcome. Welcome from New Zealand or to
Thank
New
you, thank you.
Zealand. From all the way from New Zealand. Yeah, in general, anyone who talks here, a lot of us know each other, but when you speak, maybe just introduce yourself with your name real quick. Just say this is whoever, just so everybody, and especially our new people, can get acquainted with each other. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. We're talking about David Hume. This is our first official reading in a minute. We had a long hiatus, and then our last meeting was just a review and summary of all we've read so far. If any of our newcomers want to listen to that, that's on our YouTube. We just kind of went over everything that we've read already and also started talking about how the concepts in the readings that we've covered so far become relevant to the thing that is called phenomenology, which we are soon approaching in our readings as we get closer and closer to the 20th century. So tonight was the David Hume reading. We read an excerpt from an Enquiry into Human Understanding. We read the first 25 pages, which is the first four sections. The piece was written in 1748. I wanted to bring some more historical factoids. I don't have too many, but I bet Michael does. For anyone who doesn't know Michael already, Michael is my good friend from college who helps me lead these book club discussions because Michael's a fucking genius. Michael, we love you. We stand.
Oh, you're
Michael
so sweet.
slaps. Michael slaps. Michael, do you want to give us any? I feel like you
Yeah,
have to have some sort of
I mean,
historical
you
background. Tell
want to
us a
talk
little
about the
bit about
history?
David.
I
Yeah,
feel
give us a little bit of a historical setting for David.
well. I mean, if you're thinking of England at the time, right? They're having directly at the time of this book is being written. It's following the long war between England and France, right? What was called the 8-Year War, 7-Year War. Um, the English and the French are having a huge conflict over what is the concept of liberty. They're also in the midst of what all of Europe was part of, which was called the grab for Africa and what we now call colonialism. So the question of morality and ethics, the arguments, oh, and also another thing that I'm completely forgetting about, there's also this conflict between the colonists of America, who at this point, and slightly before this, are clear British citizens without any complaint, and they start to become people who have complaints about their relationship to the motherland and start to form their own identity. Um, but also, you have the long history of British disease. And I think Hume and the thinkers that precede him, normally we connect him with two thinkers, John Locke, who has the famous idea of the blank slate, or and first and secondary qualities of
And
things.
when was John Locke?
John Locke would have been in the early 1700s.
Okay.
Um, and then Berkeley, who would have been right around the same time, a little bit after. This book was written in 1748, or was published in 1748. Um, and all of their thinking was a response directly to what we read prior. Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, who were these rationalists and who had these gigantic systems, who had this idea that you could derive from thought much of truth and reality. And for the English, who dealt with things like, two plagues that nearly wiped out their society, who had developed calculus, a form of calculus that swept the world and transformed commerce and transformed mathematics, and who were at the forefront of scientific knowledge. Their
Calculus,
form of
the first
philosophy.
internet.
What'd you say?
I said calculus, the first internet.
Yeah, I mean, really, we were just talking about programming and the programming conversation that was with Falter. Um, the conversation began with Hume and some of the arguments that he's making. So, the reason why it started that way was because Hume is one of the first thinkers who ground what we now call scientific thought, like the scientific method or the idea of pragmatism or the idea that we should base truth on empirical facts, right? Those ideas really spawn from Hume, and they also generate the counter response, which activates what we call modernity right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all the way into postmodernity, all of that is a fight between the empiricist arguments and what would follow the idealist arguments. And I don't believe we've fully passed that. Maybe this is the time that we do, but those are some facts. Slavery, colonialism, massive amounts of disease, some of the first inventions of what we would call contemporary science and mathematics. Those were all things that were happening in the mid 18th century in England.
Yeah, yeah. David said the N word in the reading.
Oh yeah.
No, the 18th century N word. That was like a random aside. But yeah, anyway, thank you. That was a really good setting of the stage for our reading. Did everyone in here? I mean, I know some of you aren't talking, but did you people in here do the reading? Eh. Some
It's
of
been
you
a while
listened
since
to.
I've read Hume, but I did
Oh,
study
okay.
him
So
back
you've
in
already.
university.
Oh, okay. What did you study philosophy?
I majored in political philosophy, so I didn't do much Hume.
Bitch.
Yeah, that's kind
Awesome.
of my interest.
Wow, that's
Very cool.
awesome.
Very, very
Shit.
cool.
So you know more than we do.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn. But I am interested
Nah,
in
nah.
your New Jersey project. I think that's
Oh,
a
hell
really
yeah.
interesting
That. Hell yeah. Oh, I would love to talk to you about that. Okay, let's make sure. I hope you stay for the whole discussion. We usually go late and just shoot the shit after. We should definitely talk about the New Jersey project. But yeah, so Michael has just kind of set the stage for our reading, which yeah, I thought it was really good. I mean, the first thing that struck me about it was really how simple it was, which I loved. And yeah, Michael is talking about, he mentioned that Hume is largely known as being an empiricist. And for anyone who just doesn't know, empiricism is the mode of science that bases everything on observation. It's this idea that all knowledge comes from observation. And that's what the reading is very much largely about. Hume is basically describing in very simple and accessible terms, Ahmed, basically how all knowledge is acquired, and he posits a few key ideas. I was trying to make an outline, but I ran out of time. But basically, this first idea that he has essentially is that all perceptions are essentially of two qualities. He divides them in these two sections, these perceptions that are thoughts or ideas, he calls them, and then sensations. And what he puts forth is that all of our thoughts and all of our ideas are predicated with our or predicated on our sensations. So otherwise, everything that we experience forms the basis for everything that we come to know. And he says this after he first gives this introduction to sort of the history, well, not the history, but I guess he's sort of describing the current climate of philosophy that he's writing in. And he talks about how within philosophy there's also these two sort of famous schools, or at least they've been come to be described sort of as two different kinds of philosophies. I believe the first section is called On the Species of Philosophies. I don't know if anyone has the reading in front of them. I wasn't able to print it. I think
Yeah,
that's
that's
what it's called.
correct.
Yeah,
Nice.
they either call it on the species of philosophies or on the different kinds of philosophy.
Of the
Okay.
different species.
And they also translate sensations also as impressions. Just
Is there a
to
translator's note in this one? I wanted to read it because I also found some of his capitalization kind of curious. I didn't know if that was a translational choice or.
I actually found a different document, and I'm going to go and post the link in the group chat. People
Okay.
can look
Post
over.
it in the book club channel.
Okay, so I'll post it in the book club channel, and that will. I think this is the best translation I was able to find. It's got some nice little notes in there. All right, just
Awesome. Yeah, I am curious about the capitalization. I wonder if it was relevant. But anyway, so basically in this first section, he's describing how within philosophy there's sort of two different modes of philosophy, at least in popular conceptions of it. There's the philosophers that are more guided by affectations, the more spirited philosophers. He uses pretty colorful language. In parts, he calls them the happy philosophers. And these are the philosophers that he describes as being easy, essentially. And then he contrasts them with these other philosophers who he describes again and again as abstruse, which is a word I wasn't familiar with. I looked it up. It just means difficult. And these are the philosophers that are more analytical and have more, their philosophies have more practical applications. And he says they're generally considered to be sort of more profound. And he feels as if within popular conceptions of philosophy, this second group of philosophers, the abstruse philosophers, are the ones that are sort of taken in higher regard and considered more seriously. But as he goes on describing this relationship between the two schools or methods of philosophy, he describes how really even the philosophers that are more spirited, the easy philosophers, still are analytical in their own ways, and that their philosophies are still informed by the same process that the other philosophers are enacting when they're more analytical. He gives an example of art too. He makes a few different allusions to art making, and he gives the example of the painter and says how, even the paint a talented artist, an art piece is made more perfect and more good by also being analytical and rigorous. And art, I mean, is like one of the most expressive modes out there, period, but even art is bettered by being analytical. The more you're familiar with anatomy or scale, the more perfect and beautiful you can make a painting. And so he uses these sort of illustrations to support his overall idea that really these schools of philosophy that sort of appear in popular culture to be in contradiction to each other really are not in contradiction to each other at all. They're sort of one and the same and cut of the same cloth. And the reason he uses this sort of uh, not illustration. The reason he sort of has this whole first section is to serve as the platform for this idea that he begins to introduce in the later sections when he makes the argument that really when we go about talking about things like rational thought and ideas and sensations, we also sort of have this idea that things like human emotion and affectation are cut of a different cloth than the ideas we have that seem more rational and more conscious and logical, right? But he makes the argument that just as these two different modes of philosophy are really one and the same, so too are all of our thoughts and ideas about the world and being in it. And that everything we do is essentially following this mode of experiencing the world and then using what we experience in the world to create our thoughts or ideas, you know. But all of this is enacted the same way. So it's kind of like, to bring it more into modern times, you know, I feel like this people still think this. It's a popular idea to act like there's matters of the spirit, or even to be less like metaphysical. You know, people act like there's ways to uh there's ways to talk about your reality and your experience, your human experience and your emotions and stuff, and these exist in some separate realm than matters of science. You know, there's matters of logic, and then there's matters of feeling and being, and these don't necessarily, they're not necessarily compatible with each other. This is a very popular idea that remains today, and David is essentially speaking directly to this idea and saying that no, all of our thoughts about being in the world and all our philosophies are given to us or acquired by us following the same exact process of experiencing and then articulating something about what we experience and using it to draw conclusions, or try to draw conclusions anyway, especially as we go about, you know, trying to construct sciences and empirical sciences. And so he gets a little specific. I mean, it gets pretty philosophy of science. He speaks about how, like I was just saying, basically everything is given to us by way of our experience. There's no new knowledge. You cannot come up with an original idea. He gives an example of he talks about the imagination, and he gives the example of a gold mountain. And he says that, yes, a thing like a gold mountain, right, obviously does not exist in reality. This is an invention of our human imagination, but it doesn't come from nothing. We know what gold is, and we know what a mountain is, and so we place the two together in our heads and create the gold mountain. And in that way, even the most, you know, unrealistic seeming figments of our imagination are still predicated on our experience in the real world and what we think we know about it, you know. He does give a really interesting illustration too, I thought, where he says he's not sure what he thinks about this, but he raises it as an important point of contention in everything he's talking about, where he wonders if maybe it is possible for the human to imagine a thing that is real that he has not experienced directly. He gives this example of a man who has been witness to every shade of blue except for very one specific shade of blue. And he says if you were to lay all the shades of blue that this man has experienced in the world in front of him, and then leave a blank space where it should be, where this one shade that he has not been he has never experienced should be, could that man imagine what that shade should look like based on all the other shades surrounding it? And he essentially says,
I
I don't
doubt
know,
it.
dude.
I doubt it.
I mean, I don't know. It's a really interesting idea, because I was trying to think in my head after. I'm like, I don't even know if I can really visualize shades, you know? Like, try to visualize a shade in your head of like a color. It's like I can sort of vaguely like see it, but not even really. So I
I
don't know.
I think there's two kind of important predicates to that specific point that he's trying to make. The
Mhm.
first one is that, you know, what you were talking about earlier, when he's making this distinction between the kind of abstract thinking and the more like emotional, poetic thinking that is popular with the people. He kind of sees the abstract thinking as when it reaches everyday life, it's kind of falls apart. It's unable to be communicated in the same way. But as you said, it's kind of held in higher regard. So even and that at times the unrigorous philosopher will use metaphysical ideas or what seemingly rigorous ideas in these sort of superstitious ways. And he says that essentially our response to a superstitious philosopher using abstract philosophy in a way that's kind of manipulative is not to dismiss all of abstract philosophy, but instead to go deeply into abstract philosophy as rigorously as we can and find if there are essential things or not. Now, he also points out about the kind of moody, poetic philosophers that he describes, that they very often are trying to derive these kind of essential, you know, singular principles that can be easily, described from one person to another. And he says, while that's probably unlikely, it is likely that we have faculty because we are able to communicate color, and I would presume he would break up all the senses in that way. We can communicate imagination and will and things of that sort. And so that when he's talking about this colors, this gradient of color, he's talking about there are probably fixed faculties in our thinking that kind of define it before our experience as part of impression, as part of sensation, which you referred to earlier. And the second thing I would bring up about that point was the way that he makes it is the person wouldn't be experiencing the color itself that was missing. They would be experiencing that the color was absent. So
Mm-hmm.
the what he brings in is something that's going to be important later, which is the idea of negativity. What is it to feel that something isn't there rather than to feel that something is there? I think that's an important part of his argument, is that
Mm-hmm.
what would be natural would be that there is color, right? So even if you were not to see color, if you saw this grading of color and there would be a part of it absent, the sense would not be of what you didn't experience, but what you can experience. That it isn't part of this natural color spectrum.
Right. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's important to note too there that he does seem intrigued by this hypothetical, though. Like, he gives it, and he says that this is a very specific example that he's not sure necessarily how he feels about. But he
Mm-hmm.
does go on, like you said, to talk about things like negativity, which he does have strong opinions on. He gives the example of Adam as the first man in the Bible, and says that Adam, when looking at water, could not have predicted that water could suffocate him if he was to be submerged under it, or that fire could consume him and kill him. And that this is true, for all things relating to that idea you just said, Michael, that you don't even hypothesize about the negative until you experience something that makes you even entertain, that hypothetical it might point to.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and the purpose in all of what he's talking about, I mean, it starts to take on more complex form, but what he establishes first is really this idea he's trying to hammer home that there is no thought that is reached spontaneously or a priori, and he also is addressing a popular idea that people have innate reason and innate knowledge, which is also an idea that I think still exists in our modern times, a lot of people seem to think that human rationality is just inexplicable, and in that sense must have some sort of unknown properties that we have not yet discovered and maybe never could. It's almost spiritual, the kind of beliefs that people have about our human modes of reason. And he seems very critical of this idea. He wants people to see as he does, which is that all ideas, whether about God or about how you feel or, your emotional response to things, versus, how something like an algebraic equation is formulated, they still are all following the same process. And we can use this process, he says, to do things like reach agreement where it might be lacking. We can easily map out the trajectory of any argument because we can start from the beginning together and say, okay, we both believe this, right? And then following from this point, we go here, right? And then if you do this, you can see where people deviate. It's a very simple, matter of fact process. But he's also not doing this to be derogatory to, the philosophers or the more metaphysical philosophers and the ones concerned with human emotion and all this. Like, I actually, something I appreciated in the reading, I felt like his very format was trying to highlight his appreciation for the philosophers that are more emotional. Like, he uses very excitable language. It's kind of passionate. There's a few parts where he gets like really kind of poetic. It made me think of Nietzsche, kind of, because I feel like Nietzsche is a good example of a philosopher who uses his poetic sort of style to make his points. And I feel like David sort of does the same thing. He wraps up a few sections with exclamation points and shit. Very colorful language. And from what I know about Hume too, he believed that essentially all rational efforts made by humans, philosophers, and scientists are essentially beholden to our human emotions and desires and what we find pleasurable and what we naturally, want to pursue. That even our most rational, objective faculties are still essentially slaves to our human emotions, and that's really why we set about trying to rationalize our experience of being in the world in the first place. But and something that Hume is really famous for, maybe the most famous for, which he touches on in the reading, is what's it called? His problem of induction, which is really interesting because he's talking about this cause and effect, right? Hold on, I have a page here I want to pull up. He's talking about how essentially, when we reach all conclusions based on previous knowledge that we acquire through our experience. But, what am I saying? But there's no way to really rationalize that between unlike objects, the things that we can expect to happen by way of our experience and what we learn about what happens when we do a thing, there's no way to rationalize that we should think that these things are repeatable. That probably sounded really confusing, but he basically
Well,
gives this example of a loaf of bread. And he says that he eats the bread, right? And he eats it, he experiences eating it, and he experiences being afforded nutrition by way of eating the bread, right? It makes sense. And because he eats the bread and experiences the nutrition, he can then go eat another loaf of bread and he expects the same thing to happen. But there's really no way to necessarily rationalize that makes sense, because he also goes on to talk about like these billiard balls. And I mean, he gives so many examples, really. He gives an example of holding a rock and letting it fall to the ground. Why do we know we can hold a rock and drop it? There's no way to predict that rock is going to fall to the ground instead of rise up to the sky. And even if it does for that rock, what makes you think that I can't just go pick up another rock and when I drop that rock, that one will rise to the sky? There's really no way to rationalize these things will be repeatable, these things that we learn by way of experience. And so he doesn't believe that humans have effectively done that. And he basically says that that is part of his mission. This is something he wants to be able to do. And I don't believe that he ever, from what I know, felt he was able to properly explain exactly why that is. You know, maybe it is an intrinsic part of our human rationality that we make these connections and, are
Well,
able to assume that the next loaf of bread will do the same thing as the previous one. But he does outline some sort of. Sorry, Michael, I'm going to let you talk in 1 second.
oh, yeah.
He does outline some sort of um, approach to trying to understand this idea in a way that he thinks to be more meaningful than the popular ideas of cause and effect, because people will say, well, I know that this loaf of bread, I know that a new loaf of bread will do the same thing as the old loaf of bread because the old loaf of bread did this thing. But David Hume doesn't think that that's a really useful way to conceptualize being in the world. He strongly disagrees with the popular conceptions of cause and effect. He doesn't believe that it's rational to say that because this happened, then this happens. Because if you stick with that model, you fall into a biased mode where you could easily be deceived. So he puts forth this sort of different model of thinking about these things, and I assume he extrapolates on that further as we continue in the reading, because he sort of just gets into that at the end of our reading. But, sorry, Michael, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to just kind of reiterate some of your points. He makes an important distinction. I believe it's at the beginning of section 4. And he's been building up to this throughout the most of the text. And section 4 is the longest section. And he defines there as being two different forms of thought. Of one being relations of ideas, and the other being matters of fact. And so matters of fact seem to be a far larger component of our thought. Whereas relations of ideas, which counterintuitively, when I read this idea, I was immediately thinking that they were going to mean the opposite. What relations of ideas mean are like if you describe a set of of algebraic equations, right, and their relationship, and they create this repeatability. Those are relations of ideas. When you go and use them, you will get nothing more than those things within this closed set of ideas. And so he does bring up the a priori one time, differently than the example that you brought up, and it's when he says 13 in the document that I'm reading and that I linked. It says events that aren't much like the common course of nature are also readily agreed to be known only by experience, and nobody thinks that the explosion of gunpowder or the attraction of a magnet could ever be discovered by arguments a priori, i.e. by simply thinking that about gunpowder and magnets without bringing in anything known from experience. So you can kind of get the negative of the argument from that the a priori is something that cannot produce anything but what is in it. So we make a mathematical proof, we now have this idea, and if someone is then uses that a priori knowledge, it has no possibility of newness. Whereas matters of fact are grounded by what you were mentioning, cause and effect. But again, he reverses it. Whereas like an earlier thinker we looked at, Leibniz, would say, well, if we had all of knowledge in the world, we could analyze everything until we knew, every detail of cause and effect all the way to the beginning of time. And what he called that was God. here Hume reverses it. He says essentially that when one is, uh, looking at a matter of fact, the less cause and effect, the less one knows about the series of causes and effects, the more vague the idea that one has is. So the work and what you were talking about in induction is to derive from what appears as a matter of fact the series of causes as far as you can go. But there's no way to ever go all the way back, and therefore there is no way to ever know for certain if the sun will rise tomorrow, or if the bread will continue to be nutritious, or if the ball will go up or down. Um, and yeah, and it's grounded by this differentiation between relations of ideas and matters of fact. Um,
Right. And I think it's important too to say that Hume ultimately found these sorts of arguments to be trivial, and he definitely wanted philosophy to have practical applications, like he wasn't just going to like sit here forever and trivialize over things like this, like that seems to be a popular theme with Hume, like don't get hung up on the bullshit.
well, I thought there was a
Uh,
really cool early part. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Where
no, you're good.
he simply says that when one writes in the abstract mode and makes a mistake, it often produces another mistake, right? So he has these, for every point he makes about one side having a tendency towards falsity, he has one for the other side, and he emphasizes, and this is right in the beginning, that the answer to it is that our lives are a mixture of different forms of thought. And I think that's something that's so different from the philosophers that we've read before. Rarely do they ever talk about, the mixture of things, that one idea and another idea can be simultaneously useful.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, he's very pragmatic, and I imagine that's part of why he's so influential. I just had this little thing I wanted to read that I found that helped me understand a little bit where he's coming from with the whole cause and effect thing and the problem of induction and how we cannot rationalize that any event is necessarily caused by another one. This is from some website. I'll link it. I'll link it in the thing, but I'm just gonna read it aloud real quickly. Um, Philosophers and scientists prior to Hume have usually believed that there is a law of cause and effect that operates in the universe and determines how objects behave. For example, if a man fires a pistol at a watermelon from 50 feet and the watermelon bursts open, philosophers prior to Hume would have explained this event by saying that the shot caused the watermelon to burst open by firing the pistol at it. Hume disagrees with this way of explaining the event. Hume argues that there are three aspects to causal behavior. Number one, spatial contiguity. The bullet and the watermelon are close together in space. Number two, temporal contiguity. We see the gunfire, then the watermelon bursts open. These events are close together in time. 3. Necessary connection. We imagine that if the gun were to fire again in exactly the same way with a new watermelon, the new watermelon would burst open. According to Hume, it is this third aspect of causal behavior, necessary connection, that we have no ground to believe in. So basically, yeah, this is very central to him. It almost seems like arbitrary, I would imagine, to certain people, but it really is interesting when you think about it, like how easy it could be if we do assume that, things like cause and effect could be rationalized. The watermelon exploded because we shot it, and so every watermelon will explode if we shoot it. This really kind of sets a trap for ourselves where we could follow all different sorts of routes that lead us into, deception if we just assume this thing that cannot be rationalized. So I think that's one of his most famous contributions, especially to like philosophy of science. This idea that the whole cause and effect is essentially almost a trickery of our perception. It feels like they're connected, And I think we all know what, we often fall into traps where things seem connected and we just kind of assume that maybe they are, luck, astrology. Oh, it seems like it must have some sort of reason, or it can't be a coincidence, but these things are really, I mean, they're easy for us to fall into as tricks.
Um,
Michael, what are you going to say?
but I was just going to bring up an earlier writer and one who I think it influenced this idea, just to connect some of the early writings that we read. Spinoza, in his book Ethics, had a very famous idea called the concept of primary cause, or the concept of first cause. And what it was a critique of the idea that everybody seems to immediately think when they see something that there is a causal relationship between that thing and, what between the two things that they see immediately. Like, elephant runs down the street in India, and someone gets hurt, and that there is a causal relationship to that. The illusion of first cause, rather, is what you call that. And his argument was instead quite similar to Hume, that when we get down to it, that there are far more complex factors at play. Here's the difference between him and Hume. There are far more complex factors at play, and that from our perspective, we are unable to fully see all of the causal factors that go into making one event relate to the other, because they are near infinite. Um, I think where Hume grounds that is by limiting what he sees as the problems of cause and effect, causation, contiguity. I think the third one he said was resemblance. But he instead doesn't blame it on infinity, the infinity of possibilities for a cause and effect. But rather, that cause and effect is determined by our sense perception, by our sense impression, and that is always going to limit our knowing. One other thing I wanted to bring up very quickly was, when we go back to the beginning, he kind of starts in the exact opposite way, but a very similar way to the way Descartes ended his meditation. Descartes ended his meditation by saying that despite him doubting his perceptions and trying to build from thought, that in the end he cannot doubt all of his perception, right? And so he has to find some way of combining these two things together. I think with Hume, through this idea of cause and effect, and also removing the concept of God in a big way, he inverts that of course we cannot just rely on our senses to explain things. We need more complex abstract ideas, but that at bottom is still always a return to our senses. And so that's a big relationship between him and a prior philosopher.
Yeah, and something you just made me think of too when you said how, some of these modes of our perception, like inferring that events are connected when they might not be, and how this limits our knowing. I appreciated what he said in the reading too about how really all philosophy and all investigations into knowing is essentially an investigation of it's sort of it's like it's like trapped within itself, and the more we know, the more we come to create meaningful philosophies, the more we illuminate our own shortcomings, and this process is essentially infinite. He says that the more that we do philosophy and do it better and make a more perfect philosophy, the more we essentially illuminate our own blind spots, and this will keep happening. But I imagine someone like Hume too also felt like this was also sort of a trivial thing to focus on because, it doesn't really matter. Like, that's just still, it's still just sort of more trickery from the way everything is formatted, and I think certain things are just sort of unavoidable. And also this word contiguity, I wasn't personally familiar with it either. I don't know if anyone else here is, but just so we have the definition, contiguity is a noun that means the state of bordering or being in direct contact with something. So similar to continuity, kind
Yeah,
of contiguity.
he uses it often as like nextness, like the thing that is next to, but also next in time. So it can be next in space, next in time. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it really was simple. I think it was like the simplest reading we've done so far. I really appreciated that. He uses commas in a weird way, but I thought that the style was so accessible, and I think it really speaks to what he's saying in his philosophy as well, which is, that these things, we do this with the hopes that it will have a practical application. Philosophy is not for sitting around and obsessing over trivial distinctions, because a lot of these things are sort of just byproducts of the way that our minds work. And not only that, but byproducts of this system of existent knowledge that exists already, that we build everything on. Like, we have to go through and sort of reform our knowledge in many ways, but we can't do anything without using the tools of knowledge that have already been created. That's all we have to work with.
I,
Um,
I, I just want to say one word that he used that really struck me, and I thought really defined the way that he was different from a lot of the thinkers in the past, was when he talks about experiment, right? When you were talking about the bread example, he frames it in terms of experimentation, that in life we are experimenting with the possibility of repeatability, right? Like,
mm,
yes, we cannot know cause and effect, absolutely, and therefore we have this experimental relationship with the future. In the past, the philosophy was framed as like this experimental thing rather than living as this experimental thing. So empiricism kind of opens up, and you see it also in what you described, his openness to the kind of more emotional poetic philosophy mixture, um, that he's trying to create something that's really useful for people. And right at the beginning, he says, the the point of of morals here. He uses the word morals, um, is to talk about things like politics. Talk about society. And in the metaphysics that we've been reading, I remember, I forget who it was who just asked during one of our talks, "What's the point?" You know, Here he sees both the purpose of the abstract metaphysical system and the way that it can build concrete thoughts, but he also sees the point in sensible argumentation, and emotional argumentation. And that when you combine all of these things together, that you get something that is far more useful to people, and at the same time more rigorous.
totally.
But
I
that
think, like,
doesn't, that, sorry, I was just going to say that still doesn't really answer the question of what's the point.
Of what's the point? The point would be that we can then apply philosophy for something other than philosophy's own sake, right? That if we had a philosophy that where the metaphysical statements about the world could then be transition to describe how we argue about a policy in law, or how we should organize in society, which is where the book goes. Then we have something that's far more useful than simply kind of what were kind of proto-existential thoughts about one's own consciousness, or metaphysical systems that describes supposed reality, but didn't really touch. They only touched in a secondary way on what we do in our lives and how we live our lives, etc.
Yeah, what do you think about that, MJ? That was you, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I
Do you think there is a point, or let's get some
I
thoughts. Let's
struggle with
let's have
that.
some.
I mean, there's ultimately what it comes down to is, yeah, we can theorize about, all of these philosophical ideas and ways of, uh, I guess, applying these theories practically to our lives, but none of it answers the question of, okay, why not just, like, why live? You know what I mean? Like, why are we trying to continue to survive? Like, why do we prefer a one instead of a zero?
Well, I would ask you, wouldn't it seem more incumbent on you to prove that there, or to create some sort of reason for why I should think there would be no purpose to survive? Because it seems to me like I don't die because my body just doesn't, My body wants food, it wants water, it feels good when I give it these things. So I just kind of like follow what's already been established for me in this mode of existing. I've just been kind of thrust into. But
Right.
like not, it seems almost like it would require more effort to put an end to my life and to like an end to the species, you know what I'm saying? Like, what do you think about that? Because that would be my response.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that's kind of like a almost a utilitarian kind of argument in terms of how you experience and express emotions. But I'd say, like, on the flip side, if you want to go down that route, how do you tell somebody who's like suicidal that uh, their emotions aren't, I guess, an evolutionary response?
Well, there was also Nietzsche's argument to go on somewhere later, but who's deeply influenced by Hume and his empiricism, that the question isn't so much whether or not there is a reason to live or not, but that we have the will to live or we do not have the will to live, right? And that these circumstances are going to be something that's singular and individual rather than being something global. And I think that's something that Hume also gets at as well, that there's a tendency to try to find an essential universal answer to things when it's more likely that we have some fixed aspects of thought and some unfixed aspects of thought where we can only get a certain degree of knowledge about them. And I think that would be useful for a question like what is the purpose of life? Why to live or why not to live? That can often be an individual question. It can often be a conceptual question. But how easily could that be a universal question without it becoming negative?
Yeah, and I'm not sure it could really. Like, I don't know how I would answer that, what you just said, MJ. Like, how would I tell a suicidal person, like, that their impulse to be suicidal is not also evolutionary? I mean, I don't
Mm.
even know if I would say that my impulse to not die is necessarily evolutionary. Maybe in the sense that, I mean, really, when we talk about evolutionary processes anyway, aren't they supposed to be ultimately sort of arbitrary? It's not that evolution prioritizes survival, it's that survival is just the consequence of evolution. I survived because I evolved. Well, not because. Oh shit, causality. But I'm arbitrarily, that's the arbitrary consequence of, a thing like a mutation that enabled me to kill my enemy. I survived. It doesn't mean that evolution, like, as a process, like, necessarily prioritizes it. We just describe it as having the goal of survival because that's what ends up being the consequence of our evolutionary mutations. But I
Well,
don't know what I would tell somebody who's suicidal. I
well,
I can't necessarily rationalize that they shouldn't be.
inevitably there's an argument here, and I think that you bring up an important argument the degree to which he removes cause and effect then removes the idea of there being a kind of motivating factor. What Kant, who would try to dispute Hume, would call motivic, a motivating factor that determines why we do things, a fatedness, right? Um, and so, a lot, you see it in scientists today. The most rigorous readers of Darwin would speak more like Bethany just did, that the that there is no actual reasoning or guidance to our evolution. Rather, our evolution has certain fixed qualities and certain mutations, and what happens is produced out of an admixture of an external world. And then there's other scientists who would talk about it as if evolution follows a process of sort of like the internal guidance system of each species, right? So you can imagine, on the one hand, that humans have an internal guidance system to survive, as Bethany was kind of disputing, and that there is some type of mutation or differentiation that makes it so that someone may not want to survive, or you could see it as a largely arbitrary structure, as Hume is suggesting, and then how someone gets to the point where they do not want to survive wouldn't be a question of why do we choose to live rather than why do we choose to die, but instead an inductive look at their series of causes and effects and their the ideas and sense impressions and memories that went into the production of them as a matter of fact, in the present, right?
Mm.
And I mean, the thing you're just talking about, evolution, like that's definitely a big debate in evolutionary science right now. And evolutionary science is still really young, and people are sort of still trying to formulate a useful philosophical approach to evolutionary science. And I think you can almost reconcile the contention by taking on sort of an approach similar to Hume's, which is that, like, maybe you could rationalize that the processes of evolution are ultimately arbitrary, but we still have to characterize it as, something that actually has some sort of use. And as humans that are going to assign meaning to things, and which is why we're doing any of this in the first place, maybe it's not trivial to necessarily characterize evolution as being teleonomic or goal driven, because even if that's sort of an illusion in some sense, it's still, everything that we try to learn about it is still going to be framed within this, or it's going to be in the context of this framing that it has a goal. Just like the goal of medicine is the betterment of humankind and our feelings of well-being and our survival. That's an arbitrary goal. That's something that we just arbitrarily decided to be a good thing or a thing to be desired, and we don't necessarily have to rationalize it within medicine. It's just sort of uncontestable. But sorry, I feel like you were just going to say something, MJ.
No, no. This is I think an interesting point of view.
Is
Much.
anyone else in here? There's a lot of red rings. I want other people to speak too. Is it just us, or who's here with us? I
Well,
feel like
Summer,
I'm on a Ouija board.
Summer,
If
that's you.
you're here, say something.
I'm
Summer
furiously
Night.
Googling plant
Oh, not a
suicide.
bot
It's
here,
fine. Don't worry about
just
it.
lurking
Oh,
and listening.
Summer, you're
oh,
really
hey. So
quiet.
wait. So not a bot is new. So not a bot. Hey, where are you speaking to us from?
I'm from Los Angeles, California.
And what's your name?
My legal name is Jeremy.
Jeremy. Welcome. Thanks for
What
joining
about your
us.
city, Jeremy?
What's
Did
that?
you do the reading?
I did not.
So you're
Sadly, I
just
don't
here to
have
listen?
yeah, I don't have any books from Hume.
We
So,
post all the PDFs online just for future reference. We don't do
all right.
literal books. They're all PDFs. So I post them all on the website. So if you want to come to the next one and read, but you don't have to read, it doesn't matter. Sorry, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. But do you
Oh
have
no,
any
it's cool. Like,
ideas?
oh no, it's
Share
cool. Like,
share what you're
it'd still be
thinking.
useful. It'd be useful to like at least peruse this stuff. I think before I come over to like the live reading and stuff. So it's
Yeah, I
useful
do read
information.
out loud sometimes as well. Like before tonight, I just read it out loud in case anyone hadn't done it and wanted to listen. So, but do you have any ideas? What do you think about all this? Let's hear some ideas.
Oh yeah, now I really feel like I'm on the spot. I think like everyone is
Tell us your
put out some.
ideas.
I think I think everyone put out some good information. I think that I forget who it was, MJ, who asked the what question about what it all means is really important. I think it's a really important thing. I think it's the reason that the what question is the reason why people tend to go to a sort of abandon all this sort of like logical thinking or whatever, however we want to call it, and go to like religion and spirituality is because my my thinking on that is that people tend to want sort of a human centric explanation of things. You know,
Mm.
sort of like it's not really sexy form or whatever. That if you the universe is sort of objectively cold, it doesn't really care about them and stuff. And you want that warm feeling of a religion or spirituality. You can like pray to a crystal or pray to a god or whatever, and it'll wind up it'll wind up doing something for you, or you'll maybe not something. Maybe it won't do something for you, but you know it'll have like a human centric explanation to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Do you feel like this can be reconciled though? Because I feel like what Hume is saying, especially, is kind of that this all of these processes can still be like a thing that we find emotional gratification in, you know? Like philosophy doesn't have to be, or even science, natural science doesn't have to be this like cold thing. If anything, for me personally, I feel like it's all of these things and knowledge and schools of knowledge that we create for ourselves are sort of testament to our own abilities, you know? Like it makes me like really proud to be a member of humanity, and like it's almost like a spiritual experience for me, you know? Like do you feel like there's a way to reconcile this idea people have you're just talking about, that this is all just like a bunch of like cold bullshit, and you know it's
Well,
not going to help you lead a meaningful life?
I just
Yeah,
wanted. Oh, sorry.
Wait, let him
I,
finish, Michael.
Yeah, of course.
I want to know what he says.
I was about to say I hope so. Right now, I'm personally on still on sort of a downward spiral from leaving a sort of fundamentalist branch of Christianity. So I'm still in that point where I'm trying to find like a like a meaning or like any sort of fulfillment in something other than Jesus. Like I kind of described the sort of vacuum that gets left behind by all that as sort of like a God-shaped hole or a God-sized hole that's kind of hard to fill if you've been doing that for a long, thinking that for a long time. It's very easy to kind of fall either into a bunch of woo bullshit or sort of a despair in a sort of Kierkegaardian sense, I guess.
Was it recently that you converted from Christianity to nothing?
Um, if you want to say 4 years ago as recent, yeah.
Okay. Well, I also come from a fundamentalist Christian background, and I'd love to talk to you more about it if you wanted to. But for me personally, I don't know if this gives you any consolation, but when I left Christianity, like I felt almost the exact opposite of what you're describing. Like I felt like Christianity, I don't know what branch were you raised in?
It wasn't necessarily a specific branch that I can recall. It seems like it was
Mm.
every branch of Protestant fundamentalism that you could sort of like get to like we went to Adventist churches and Baptist churches and evangelical churches and like stuff like that and stuff. And my mom was also raised Catholic, so it's like you get it, getting it from both ends. Um,
Mm.
but also I'll say that when I did initially leave it, like it was very, very liberating. Like the idea that I didn't have to be right about the God question, like at
Mm.
all. Like that didn't matter anymore. It's just the sort of the remnant of dealing with it, sort of, I guess. So yeah, I like
Well,
to talk to you about how you wind up handling that.
yeah, I would love to talk to you about that. And I don't know if you watch the videos on the channel, but my
I
video
do.
about spirituality, like I talked about, I actually kind of talked about what Hume was talking about in this reading, and like I just find so much personal affirmation in reflecting on the fact that everything that once allowed us to rationalize the existence of a God and, you know, our position in the world as relative to him and all this shit, these those rationalizations were still made the same exact way that now we rationalize there is no God, you know, and like maybe philosophy is
Hmm.
important and rational thought is a thing to be pursued, you know. And I feel like because there's really no intrinsic difference in how we are reaching these sorts of conclusions about the meaning of existence, whether we rationalize that there is a God and that is the meaning of everything, or we rationalize there is no God, which means that everything we ever thought about meaning is like not what it we previously thought. These are
Hmm.
still processes that we are they're enacted exactly the same way, you know. And the more I reflect on it, the more I just feel like so much, I guess, faith in myself. I feel like I'm the platform for everything that happens in the realm of my thought, you know. And the same is true for all of us. Like I feel like there's more agency without Christianity, you know, especially since Christianity is so it's so obsessed with convincing the Christian that they are worthless, fucking stupid, imbecile that can know nothing. Like, I feel like that's probably the thing about Christianity that, like, really fucked up my self confidence in particular, you know?
Hmm.
Like, it's just. It's all about how you know nothing. And every time,
Hmm.
you know, Christians are confronted with a difficult question, especially philosophical questions, the answer is always like, his ways are mysterious, you know? Like, we can't know everything, you know? Like, everything about Christianity speaks to this self imposed limitation of our own abilities. And so, like, I feel like even though I do relate to also your feelings of like, the magic is partially gone now or something, you know. I think that that feeling will diminish the more you kind of think about really like everything fucking is magic. Like it's fucking
Oh.
crazy that we're just like here, dude, you know? Like I feel like life seems so much more wondrous and mysterious and crazy to me the farther I get away from Christianity, you know. I mean, I've been out of it for a long time now, but I think like life has never really seemed so fucking trippy. And especially the more I get into philosophy too, I'm just like, damn, everything
Yeah.
is nuts, bruh.
Yeah.
So I hope you don't
I think
despair.
Yeah, I think a majority of the despair, as I call it, is it has to do with what you're talking about, as far as it being drilled into you that you're nothing and that you don't know anything, you're not worth anything without God or without Jesus and stuff like that. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
more of it as a. I think that's more has more to do with it than any sort of sense of disenchantment. When I actually initially left Christianity, I was more like you. When I was like, this was like I said, it was liberating. Like I was it's like you didn't have to be right all the time about the
Mm.
salvation question. It's more like it's sort of the erosion of of the self, sort of that you're trying to
Mm.
build back up. That sort of like that sort of pushing that boulder up, like you're Sisyphus or somebody. You know,
I feel
it,
that. But don't
it's sort of.
necessarily commit to that characterization, you know, because I think sometimes what feels like a void or something is just our inability to recognize that we're actually in some sort of transformative period, you know. So don't resign to that, soldier. I believe in you. And I think, like, yeah, we were just saying, like, Christianity tells us we know nothing. And
Hmm.
our response to that is, fuck that, I do know something. I know that this is bullshit. And now we're out here in the open, exposed, butt naked. And now
Yeah.
we have to just stand firm, I think, in that resolution that, like, actually, I do know things. And, you know, it's so true. I think that even outside of Christianity, this idea that, like, humans don't know everything, there's things we can't know. This is an idea that I think is so alluring to so many people. And that's why we see so many people, even the people that are most critical of Christianity, that get into paganism and the occult and stuff. It seems like everyone is always so tempted to find some sort of mode of spirituality to which they can resign that they don't know certain things, you know? It's like humans want to resign to this feeling that I just can't know everything. It's like if you do that, it's almost like, you know, it's like self-resignation. It's like it feels so self-defeating and ascetic. So I
I
Yeah.
don't
think
think
that
it's
it's not just a Christian
necessarily.
thing.
I don't think it's necessarily like, self-resignation or, admitting that you don't know everything. I think it's more being able to believe that there is more to know,
Okay.
that there is something beyond what we can directly experience or what we already know. It's
But don't
it's
you
Yeah.
faith.
think But don't you think, MJ, that also, like, these people I'm talking about, because I totally appreciate that idea and I agree with you. And to bring it back to the reading real quick, like, Hume really values this idea as well when he talks about how he almost basically says ignorance is a virtue in many ways, you know, like to be able to acknowledge that you don't know everything and that as you continue you will probably find things that totally like refute everything you thought you knew before. I think that's a really valuable mode to exist in, and I think that's what you're saying. But the people I'm talking about, when I say they resign to feeling like they know nothing, I feel like I'm talking about people who essentially like commit allegiance to like certain systems, you know, to say I believe in astrology. Like I feel
Mm-hmm.
like you're signaling like, okay, this is a thing I don't understand, but I can't understand, you know, or people who just like commit to specific sort of religions or modes of spirituality. Like I personally, I know I'm a hard ass, but like I am joking a lot about astrology. I feel like I'm technically open to the possibility that sure, maybe there's something there, you know. I definitely don't believe there is, but I feel in that sense, and maybe I'm wrong and being having too much of an ego or something, but I feel like in that sense I consider myself more open-minded than the person who believes in astrology, even though they would call me closed-minded, because I feel like that person has made allegiance to astrology and basically said, no, this is real. And I just don't understand why it's real. And we don't have to because humans don't know everything. Whereas
I,
I feel like maybe it could be, but I definitely don't believe it is for
I,
Yeah. It's like
reasons.
it's a. I was just about to
I,
say it's sort of like a negative or inverted sense of like Socrates' position. Like all I know is I know nothing, but it's like
Mm.
more sinister, or however you want to
Poor
say
sinister.
it.
Yeah. Michael, what
I
were
would
you going to
say
say?
it's okay to give up on like religion as an institution, but I would be more careful or I guess giving up on the concept of God. It could just be about, reconceptualizing the idea. So like for example, when I was a kid, my cousin was playing StarCraft and I like went up to him and I asked him like which one are you? Like which character are you? And he said, I'm all of them. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, I didn't
Wait, he was
understand that.
playing what?
StarCraft, you know that game?
Starcraft.
Yeah, I think I know what it is. He
Oh,
said
yeah,
he's
Star.
all the characters.
Yeah, he's like, I'm all of them.
That's deep as
And,
fuck.
dude, right? But that's kind of how I think about God, like, these days.
well,
That
I think there's like getting back to text. There was an offshoot of Hume that's very recent. There's this guy named Quentin Melissu, and he came up with this concept of hyper chaos, right? And hyper chaos is very similar to Humean notion of the idea that we cannot follow cause and effect, that we cannot know if the sun will rise or not. What Melissu argues is that within a field where we cannot know exactly what is going to happen, then it's theoretically possible that tomorrow we could rise and the Abrahamic God would be right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, a guy who Hume is responding to, and I think has a positive relationship with Spinoza, um, for Hume, he is dissolving the human consciousness from attempting great knowledge to non-knowledge, right? And for Spinoza, that perspective was what he called a mode. A mode, the compilation of all modes, was what he would call God. And so, in similar ways, philosophically, there are aspects of this that do not get entirely away from God or do not entirely refute God. They just present it as something different. When you called it the universe indifferent, right? That's exactly how one would describe Spinoza's God. Or if you talk about indifference, you would Melissu's idea of an absolutely random, mathematically possible God. That would be both indifferent and a kind of philosophical argument for the possible existence of a God. You know?
Well, I was thinking of Spinoza too when MJ was just talking about StarCraft and the person saying that they're all the characters. And MJ, I don't know if you've read Spinoza, but I feel like, or
Haven't.
not. You should read the. I'll link you to the readings that we did. It was not long before this reading. I think you'd be really interested in it because, or was it Leibniz? I confuse the two. They're very similar. Either way, the readings are combined under 25 pages, but one of them, I think it was Leibniz, has this similar idea that God is almost characterized as like what unites everything. Like what is
Mm-hmm.
universally true about the universe. But
Yeah,
I would also say that I think that in that sense, doesn't the word God almost become arbitrary? Because it's like God has so many definitions. Like, I feel like what you're saying might be possible as a God is really not something I would necessarily even refute. It's just what you're deciding to call God now. But like, I'm using God more in like the popular sense of the word as like this sentient being that designed all of us and created us. I absolutely don't believe in that. But if you're defining God as maybe like some universal impulse that exists and unites all matter, with some sort of unified purpose, like I'm not necessarily completely turned off by that idea. I'm like willing to entertain that, but I think it all comes down to really like what possibilities are worthy of being entertained. And if you can't give any sort of good reason for why one should be entertainable, I would say I think it's safe and not necessarily close-minded for an individual to like not pursue it. Do you agree
No,
with that? Like, what do
definitely.
you think about
Yeah.
that?
No, I totally agree with you. I think people tend to gravitate towards like black and white kind of thinking, um, because it's easier. When you kind of delve into these sorts of ideas and you find yourself going down the rabbit hole or getting stuck in circles, um, it can be difficult for people, especially if you were raised in like uh, institutionalized religion. That can be a pretty long and hard fall, and it's hard to get out of that nihilism. So I don't blame people for wanting kind of a quick and easy solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I
Yeah.
understand it, but I
Yeah,
don't necessarily respect it.
yeah, I understand
Yeah.
that too. I definitely understand wanting like a soft landing after leaving like a religion that's been essentially every aspect of your life. If you just want to, you're not gonna just jump into like atheism or secularism or agnosticism like it's butt naked and stuff. You're gonna wind up finding something that is a little bit different, but kind of more or less the same and stuff. Like kind of the way I see it is like people don't really necessarily change too much. It's just you wind up more or less staying on the same, like how a branch grows and it sort of branches off into different stems. You just wind up doing that as far as like major choices in your life. So I think it's kind of where I went with religion and stuff. That I left Christianity and like immediately went into Satanism.
Oh my god, me too!
Really?
Yo, yes. Because I think, yeah, like you're just saying, I felt like it fulfilled something I felt I needed in that moment. And for me, it was like extreme self affirmation, which I feel like Satanism really offers. You know, it's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
a fuck you. Like you told me I couldn't masturbate, I couldn't do drugs. Like I'm gonna do all these
Yeah.
things. And you told me I had to be nice to the people who are mean to me. Fuck them. Like, you know, it's like basically the ultimate rebellion. And that's why Anton LaVey chose Satan as the mascot for the fucking
Yeah.
philosophy, because that's really what it is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
And
you kind of feel that way, but it's like it's a soft landing. It's more or less the same. You're changing, and especially with like LaVey and Satanism and stuff, a lot of aspects of it, you're really just sort of changing the furniture on Christianity and stuff. You're taking out pictures of Jesus and
totally.
putting up a Baphomet sigil.
well,
Um,
I just
It's just as vain. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
I feel like we should also kind of invert the question a little bit. I think there's a good public example of this recently, and it also gets at some things that Hume earlier is talking about in the affective society. Recently, Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? He brought up three examples. He was trying to make the argument that the rejection of science, right? The rejection of empirical knowledge was not simply a right-wing phenomenon. And he brought up three different things. He brought up, on the one hand, climate change. Um, on the second hand, he brought up uh, um, denial of vaccines. And then on, I guess, the first foot, he brought up believing in astrology or believing in crystals, right? And he was like,
mhm.
"Oh well, in a very untrue way, he identified vaccine denial with liberals when it's across the map. Climate
Mhm.
change is largely related to right wing philosophy, and then you would identify a lot of the New Age philosophies and religious doctrines with a sort of liberalism or a sort of apoliticism or something. But
Yeah.
what he did not acknowledge was that each of these things have a degree of intensity in which the way they affect the world, right? And so we can think about it the opposite way as well. What Hume, I think, would go and look at a matter of fact, something like a religion, right? And then he would inductively try to follow the information that we have, the content and the things that drove it, and derive from that a better, more rigorous knowledge about that thing, and what that knowledge would create could range. Um, like when you go and you think about life after God and these kind of linear relationships between absence of God or the occurrence of God, God as this form or God as that form. You instead look for kind of like the qualitative, spatially contiguous or temporally contiguous elements of the religion itself, and how does that affect people? Buddhism versus the Muslim religion or whatever, various sects of one tribe versus another. That is a philosophically applicable way that thinking, as Hume is describing, would allow us to get more detail out of life and understand our own lives better.
Totally. Summernet, are you there? Summernet.
He was there for a second, talking very
Oh,
quiet.
I see green. Summernet, turn up your mic.
Can anyone fucking hear me?
Louder.
I heard fucking.
Say something. Give us some insight, please. We desire your input. Summernet. Where the hell did he go? Well, whenever he pops back.
He's in
Yeah,
the
Michael,
chat.
Oh. Summernet, what are you doing? Get in here, bitch. Yeah, Michael, I appreciate what you just said. I definitely think... I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but I actually have some confused ideas about the whole vaccination thing, personally. I kind of think that a lot of what we call anti-vaxxers are not really anti-vaxxers the way that we describe them.
Ooh,
Because
what do
I
you
was...
mean?
Well, okay, I don't want to get too off topic. We have to come back. But I'll just briefly tell you. I was like talking about anti-vaxxers on like Twitter or something, and this woman contacted me, and she is somebody who vaccinated her child and feels that her child had like a severe neurological reaction to the vaccination, and it wasn't autism. This lady does not think that her kid like got a vaccine and then became autistic, which is like the thing that we hear all the time about anti-vaxxers, and we treat them like they're just so crazy and stupid. But apparently, and after looking into it, I believe this is true, the FDA is even open about the possibility that some of these vaccinations do have neurological side effects. Like, this isn't a thing that's like entirely conspiratorial. This is a thing that they're like relatively open about. It's a very small incidence of people who have side effects, but this woman, she doesn't even believe that like kids should not be vaccinated. She just believes that vaccines are not necessarily held to a high enough standard, and that people need to talk about it more, and that also, people who have faced the repercussions of these side effects that apparently are proven to happen, they should be more adequately compensated. And so recently, like, I've become sort of more critical of popular
Well,
criticisms of anti-vaxxers, because
well,
I feel like they almost benefit the fact that, like, the FDA is held to pretty much a fucking invisible standard as it is, like, we
well,
don't hold them accountable for anything. So I'm not surprised that these sorts of things are happening, and if true, they're benefited from this popular criticism of anti-vaxxers that treats them all like they're a bunch of fucking crazy hysterical moms that
well
think their kids have autism.
I want to mention that I had a very similar conclusion, based on the Neil deGrasse Tyson quote, which was that the way in which that Tyson denies what Hume is teaching in the text is that by becoming dogmatic about your belief in the denial of science as being unilateral, that the belief in crystals is the same thing as climate change, is the same thing as denying vaccines, that every denial of vaccines is the same, or that every denial of climate change is the same, is a tendency in science that makes it so that people come to doubt science and to believe that its assuredness, its absolute assuredness, is a sign of potential falsity and a tendency towards falsity. And I think what you bring up is exactly that it's not simply the and also what So Not a Robot brought up. It's not simply the Christian ideology or Christian institution that creates these large-scale forms of thought that are rigid and fixed. Something like science can can be just as fixed and just as indifferent to outside information as long as it doesn't follow the kind of like openness to mixture, to change, to questioning cause and effect that Hume suggests.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. I think that's
Mhm.
totally true and an observable phenomena. You see a lot of people who become very anti-scientific are people who cite like one example of science being justifiably wrong about something, and they use that to just be like, okay, well, it's all a fucking sham.
And science
Though at
denies
the same
it
time,
all. Science will
Yeah.
say, "Oh, no, you haven't gotten it right," or "We're right 99% of the time," and therefore, but instead of accepting that there is fallibility, that the development of science is anarchic, like we're going back through the development of science in this reading group. We're going and looking at the ideas that would eventually become what we see as codified science. You cannot tell me that what Hume is saying here is like some determinate factual statement about something. No, he's doing the exact opposite. And so when we pretend to do so now, and I don't mean we, I mean the scientific community, and a lot of scientists are trying to move against this form of thinking, but as long as we do that, it's a self-production of your enemy. You know, you tell everybody that you're absolutely right, and and a group of people all find random examples of you being wrong. That collective group of examples turns into evidence of your general wrongness, which is sad because it breaks down scientific thought.
totally. Right
Hmm.
before you said that, I was going to say, like, that's why I think it's important for institutions like science to have more transparency and accountability, because these people aren't necessarily like totally wrong for being distrustful of it as an institution when, yeah, there's so many examples of science being corrupt or, misled, and then they don't really admit that to themselves. And that's something that I think Hume really valued too. To bring it back to the reading again, I really loved how
Mhm.
much he spoke about ignorance as like a thing to be really like accepting of and open with.
Hmm.
Ignorance is virtue. Summernet,
Mhm.
there you are.
Isn't
Say something.
so? Isn't it possible that because I have a lot of feelings
Can
about
you get louder?
I'm
I
gonna
can
try
I
to
can
turn the
try.
volume.
You're
I'm
all
on
the way
max.
up
Is this
on
any better?
a little, yeah.
So one of the things I wonder is it possible that the philosophy, quote unquote, of science is being approached from a Christian lens, and these are two different perspectives that aren't meeting each other. They're grading each other by their own rubric. Like, one of the biggest things that is lobbed against science is, well, you're all part of this. You're believing this new science religion. You're all part of this new cult of science, listening to your science pope and shit. So you're just like us, where you have Christianity, you have a framework, but the way Christianity works, as it brings things together. It's not only an authoritative view of the world, it's an experiential authoritative view. And when you look at that with science, maybe that's not being communicated as well, or maybe it's assumed that a good system should be experiential as well. That a lot of people, they recognize the value of science to give you stuff. It's an actionable philosophy, but as like an experiential one, it doesn't coddle you. It doesn't necessarily. It provides like a system of beliefs, but like it's hard to really relate and live through science and bring science into your day
I
with the ease, and it can happen. But for many, it's not as approachable as it is for the more familiar bar of bring Christ into your life.
I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
that's
entirely true. I feel like it's a scale of degree. Like if you look at a guy like Sam Harris, and now obviously we're talking about non-scientists. Very frequently, what we describe as scientism or this kind of religion of science they are people who know a fair amount about a science but aren't actually scientists who are arguing for this viewpoint where science should be centered in our kind of moral, ethical, and social concerns. And in those argumentations, which often drive a lot of the people who say they believe in science, quote unquote, there are like clear ethical propositions. Like Sam Harris would talk about kind of like the pursuit of happiness as being kind of like this essential sort of evolutionary drive, and with that comes this idea that we should be individualistically determined, and so all of these things, they start to point you toward a certain political view, a certain social perspective, a certain relation to other people, a certain criticism of other people. Like how often is it that a person who follows Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris will have some type of like pretty radical view about Muslim people, for instance, right? So, I think that obviously it does not create this clear, defined system of moral rules the way that a Bible does. But
Well,
it does
that's
have
not
some.
necessarily true. I mean, just for a quick example, if you think about Alcoholics Anonymous, like the 12-step program, that's something that's like quote unquote scientifically proven to be the most effective treatment for alcoholics. And the first step of that is to kind of submit to a higher power. So
Well, I mean,
in these
Yeah.
kind of
Wait,
ways,
can I respond as well?
yeah.
I wanted to respond to what someone had said and what you just said, both of you, Michael and MJ. I feel like what we read in the reading tonight was actually really relevant to this idea, because when you think about it, there's really nothing different about the process that leads us to a conclusion like there is a God and life has a meaning, as like abstaining from alcohol will help me be healthier, or the earth is fucking round. Like any scientific fact or any conclusion I draw about meaning and existence, I feel like all these things are done by way of the same process. So to answer Summoner, I would say that I think this is an idea that should be venerated and promoted more, because I don't think it's that people need to find meaning within science necessarily, but I think science as a tool is something that enables you to create a worldview that's created sort of in accordance with the same kind of principles. Like for me personally, I feel like my philosophy is definitely enriched by my scientific understanding, but I don't feel like I necessarily find a meaningful philosophy in and of itself in science. And why would I necessarily? But I think that that's also like a worthy criticism, because it's definitely true that there's a lot of people like Michael was talking about, like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, that have almost like made science into some sort of a religion. But I feel like these men are like perfect examples of the kind of attitude that usually accompanies these people. They're just sort of like self-righteous pricks that want to feel like they're more intelligent than everybody else, and just like, ooh, like you and your feelings. Like, it's just so pointless and trivial. There's never been any reason to believe that natural science in and of itself is the be all to end all of everything. Like, it just doesn't even make sense. And I have to rationalize, like Michael was saying, some pursuit of happiness as being some function of my biology that comes to me by way of evolution. It's just completely unnecessary. Sorry, Jeremy, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was saying like that. That's going back to what I was saying about, at least on the other side of like religion and stuff. Like it feels like, as someone who was a believer and looking at science, you're looking at it as what you call a rival system. Like how Summernet was saying. Like you're looking at sort of like a rival system and stuff. You're looking at it as something that's going to be replacing your belief system whole cloth, and you don't have that sort of experiential sort of sense to it. You know what I'm saying? Like you don't have that. What I think how I was saying it was like a human centered sort of aspect to it. It's just it's an explanation of how the world goes, of how the world works. you know, of how reality works. And a lot of people, I think, wind up finding they wind up not being prepared for that, and they do wind up like at best, like you were saying, like Michael was saying with Sam Harris and stuff, you wind up at best having people try to turn science into a religion itself, which, like you were saying, doesn't really work, doesn't translate that well. That's not what it does.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes into everything else we're saying tonight too. That even to assume that science is contradictory to a thing like religion is still it's an irrational assumption. There's no need to even think that. Like science, and it goes with everything, everything Hume is saying. Science doesn't even contradict religion or spirituality in any way. Like people who believe there is a God believe there is a God because they experience, my mom's calling me, because they experience the world and they think that the world is so wonderful and meaningful, and they see other people who believe in God and they say, yeah, that makes sense. Everything about their experience suggests to them that there is a God, and that becomes a rational conclusion. And the same exact thing is true for science. I believe that the earth is round, because people have seen it. Oh my God, my mom keeps calling me. Someone else talk. I think I might have to answer her real fast.
So, I kind of want to backtrack on what I was saying before a little bit, and focus more on the mode of a philosophy and how they might be different. Because for science, I think it does cover what you're saying a little bit about Dawkins. It does cover a little bit about just science in general. Like there's this fetishization of congruity, where things like like that insufferable asshole every time who's telling you about logical fallacies as if they've completely freed themselves of bias, or that they're making an absolute shithead of themselves. Yeah. So science, I mean, for example, it's that kind of thing. Like the if you're right and correct, then it means you have all the answers, and that you basically have your stories right. With Christianity, there's a chief authority, and all the merits are derived by its ability to answer everything, and so science in the true science form is saying, oh, I know 99% of this shit, but this is something I inherently don't know. But to Christianity, or someone who needs to find a belief structured system, I think they would say, oh, so you don't have all the answers, so you do admit you have weakness, so you do admit that you're wrong, you do admit that your model doesn't work because you only said 99%. It's not, it doesn't cover the same thing. It doesn't cover the same needs.
Summer, I don't know if you've heard of the book called Against Methods by Feyerabend, Feyrebend. He was basically arguing that when we developed the concept of the scientific method, which was dominant in scientific thought from like the positivists of the early 1900s all the way up to say like the 80s, right? He was saying that if you look at the history of science, it is really a series of mistakes and failures, experimentations and accidents, and that out of this mixture of both intentional and unintentional things, that we've created this body of ideas that is a mixture of all different sorts of things. Similarly, I was reading in a mathematics book that I was talking to Falter about earlier, and they were also arguing that when scientists and mathematicians describe their thinking, they often do so with a continuity. I don't know if that's the word you used earlier because you were quieter, but that isn't actually existent in the practice. So I think there is a kind of ideal form that is practiced by certain scientists, and it might be a majority of scientists. That is exactly what you say. That it does not have the same type of kind of appeal to a lifestyle, to a moral structure, to a system of rules, and that that is a meaningful aspect of science. But it's worth then wondering, what is it that drives one to need a kind of fixed scientific idea? Is it possible to separate science that developed out of religious thought from having kind of religious aspects, or will it be some new concept, some new approach to thinking, just the way that science grew out of philosophy and religion, that will make it so that we can, really understand that it's just a mixture of thought that allows us to really gain knowledge.
Phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
Sorry, my mom was calling, and
If you
I'm
will.
not sure. I'm not sure what I missed. I just tuned back in for that. But to bring it back to phenomenology, I mean, this is part of why I like phenomenology so much, because I feel like it really does kind of, not that there needs to be a reconciliation, like I was saying, I don't think science needs to necessarily be a system that we use to create meaningful worldviews. But I feel like because it already sort of does that for anybody who puts faith in science, which is literally, I mean, I would say just about every person, like no matter who you are, even if you say you don't believe in science, if you believe in the system of observation that affords you with like some sort of learning, which Hume says in the text as well. He says that basically anybody who says that they disagree with what he's positing there, like, must have some alternate mode of reasoning that no one else fucking knows about. Because, like, even the most anti-scientific person, if they learned how to walk by putting one foot in front of the other, that is the scientific mode. Like, all science is, as a philosophy at its most skeletal, is simply this a description for this process of observing and trying to infer something about what you're observing. So I like phenomenology so much because I feel like it does in many ways sort of unite. I won't say reconcile. It sort of unites what I find to be most meaningful about philosophy and most meaningful about the natural sciences, and sort of creates this system where the two, I think, are already symbiotic and mutually beneficial, but it just is sort of a whole new institution that kind of marries the two.
Um,
The
I,
science of experience and meaning. I
I, I
love it.
think I think there that before we even get to phenomenology, there's two thinkers that come to mind for me, Kant, and who directly responds to Hume, and then Freud
Who will
later.
be reading next?
Yep, the Kant who we'll be reading next, and Freud later with his idea of the unconscious, who throws a wrench into what it is that that Hume is getting at. Right? They're not contradicting him, but what they are adding is that there is possible to have these kind of internal predicative concepts in our minds that determine our thinking, determine our behavior, determine the outside world from in rather than the the inside world from out. Um, because if we are determined by, if the faculties are something that are these concrete things registered in our brains, right? And if we have this genetic structure that is this relatively concrete form that is metastable over time, and if we have unconscious behaviors that act out against both our thought and even prior to our impressions, our sense impression, um, then there is the question of, is there a third aspect to human consciousness? Is there, in addition to matters of fact and relations of ideas, as well as that, the unconscious, the immediate, the the non-thought that is within the human brain.
Well, Hume sort of, in the reading we did, he sort of alludes to this as well, though, doesn't he?
He
In the
does.
beginning, in the
Yeah.
beginning, he talks about there being two distinct, or no, not two. He says there's distinct modes of thinking that are unlike each other, you know, and he sort of references this.
Yeah.
He
He talks
alludes to
about
some sort of idea of a subconscious, though obviously he doesn't call it that.
Yeah,
But
he talks about like imagination and will, and he lists four of them. I have it written down somewhere. If you want to continue
well,
talking.
really early in the text, I don't know
Yeah.
if you're on a computer, but he does talk about different parts of thinking,
Yeah.
and it sounds like he's talking about a subconscious. We should talk about the subconscious actually, because I have like really conflicting ideas about the subconscious, and I want to know what you guys think. Like, to me, the more I think about it, I feel like there's probably definitely truth to that idea that there's some sort of meaningful, or there's some sort of a practical use for characterizing some part of your thinking as being unconscious, you know, which would refer to like the memory of all that you might have like stored in your psyche or something, you know, that you're referencing. But I feel like people use the term like way too loosely, and I
I think
really
there's
don't agree with how it's used. Like, what are you gonna say?
I was just gonna say I think there's two ways that people use it, and I think you might have just been going toward it. So you should.
Yeah, I don't like how people use it like I feel like the popular way that people use it is sort of just to say like, "Oh, I'm unconsciously thinking right now," or something, you know, like, or I have unconscious desires. Like they sort of speak of it as if like there is a little deep ghost you that's like inaccessible at all times, and then it rises to your conscious occasionally. But when I think about it, I feel like oftentimes the way people use the word is almost just to describe every part of thinking that you don't articulate back to yourself in your head. I guess my problem is not so much with the popular definition of the subconscious, so much as it is the popular definition of the conscious mind. Because the popular definitions of the conscious mind seems to just be the part of yourself that literally talks in your head. But I feel like that's such a dumb idea to pursue, because it's like, dude, like, I don't, how often do you, yeah, I talk to myself in my head a lot. I say sentences and stuff, but I would say for the most part, I really don't, you know? Like, I was thinking about this recently watching a YouTube video, and I'm like, dude, how the fuck I'm computing this. I'm not sitting here thinking, okay, that guy said that guy walked through the door, you know? Like, my brain is such a fucking complex machine that I can sit here and watch this abstract visual representation of something that's never even happening in this, like, artificially simulated environment that I'm witnessing on a digital screen, and I don't have to articulate any of what's happening back to myself to understand perfectly what's happening, you know? Like, what would you call that? Because I'm not talking about it to myself in my head. Is that unconscious that I'm doing all of this stuff and computing? I feel very conscious of what I'm witnessing on the YouTube screen. I'm very up in it. When I'm watching a movie, am I conscious of the movie? Or am I unconsciously computing it? Like, would you say that's I'm consciously aware of it?
There's a really good book by this neurophilosopher named Thomas Metzinger called Being No One. I think I mentioned it one other time in book club. Yeah, and I really love it. It's a long book, but what he does is he brings a whole bunch of different neuroscientific studies, right? And he shows all the different ways in which modular aspects of the brain do things without our being like, cognizant of it. For instance, there are two connections between the eyeball and the brain, and for certain patients after traumatic brain injury, one of those have to be snipped, but they're still able to track objects. Or someone loses their ability to track faces, but they have all of these other qualities of the human being that they can recognize. But when they see the person's face as a picture, they can never put a name to it. But if they heard their voice or smelled them or something like that, that that they would have some type of real conscious experience or maybe non-conscious experience. The conclusion he comes to is that what we call consciousness is not so much a single entity. That narrative is really what you're talking about. It's simply just the aspect of us that talks, but that instead consciousness is this simultaneous complex of a whole bunch of separately operating systems, ranging from long-term to short-term to working memory to vision
Mm-hmm.
to conceptualizing, and all the way up to big brain meta theory, right? Like all of that is working at the same time, but one of it can be cut and something is still going on, right? So there isn't this
Right.
like whole that we imagine. At what point do you snip
I
part
know.
and it stops being a consciousness? Which
That's
is
such a vain idea. Like, I feel like this is something I'm so annoyed with more and more. Like, fucking Elon Musk is out here chasing fucking dumb consciousness theories, like, and Ray Kurzweil. And it's disappointing because, like, Ray Kurzweil is really intelligent, but it's like people just get caught up in this fucking idea based on nothing that consciousness has to be like this little fucking ghost thing that lives in your head. Ooh, and maybe it can exist outside of your body. Like, why do we pursue this idea when I think it's much more likely that it's much more like what you were just describing, Michael? Like, I define consciousness, what I think consciousness is simply the feeling of being conscious, you know? Just like I define my hearing as the thing that I experience because I can hear, you know? But could I remove my hearing from myself and make it exist externally to me? No, that's like a ridiculous idea. And maybe if I could, even, because I'm sure like some guy at MIT could fucking replicate my hearing in some little fucking test tube vacuum, whatever the fuck they're doing over there, like it wouldn't really matter, you know? Like, what is my hearing without myself? I feel like the same is likely true for consciousness. Like, why would I think it's anything more than just the feeling of being a conscious being, and conscious as defined as exactly what you were just saying, the sum of all my abilities to perceive my external world, you know?
well, there's this famous quote by Chomsky, and this slightly deviates, but I think it also applies. And he's talking about the idea of free will, and he's like, all the time for like the history of philosophy, people have been asking this question: Are humans free or are we determined? Right? And he's like, what if aliens came to this planet and were like, you all are completely thinking about the problem wrong, right? And I think consciousness is another problematic that humans have been banging their heads against over and over again. And it's because we are conscious, or we are conscious by whatever definition we give to consciousness at that time. That creates a basic cycle of reification where as soon as we say something about consciousness, we are inherently negating another proposition about consciousness that could be equally true. And so the whole idea of thinking of consciousness as anything but either a process or the correlate of some type of system and just an illusion, all these kind of unified singular ideas seem pretty specious.
Yeah. And it's frustrating because consciousness really is trippy, but I think for totally different like reasons, you know? Like, I think properties of, well, it's I don't know how you would say it, because if consciousness is not necessarily a singular thing, I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say it has properties. But I guess the feeling of it having properties, like intentionality, which Husserl is very concerned with, like that is fascinating to me. Like thinking about how I can feel like I'm directing my consciousness at a certain phenomena and ignoring the others, and then being able to sort of scan the room as if my consciousness is like a fucking radar, some bullshit. Like, I can choose to focus on the cup and tune out everything in my peripheral vision, or I can just as easily choose to scan my consciousness over and now look at this notebook, you know? Like, what the fuck is that, bro? Or when you're in a crowded bar and you're talking to somebody, like, why can I choose to listen to my friend who I have to literally strain myself to hear because it's so loud? But if I want to tune out, I can totally tune out and listen to what the fuck the person behind me is saying. And then I can even recall after I consciously tune out my friend talking. If I want to tune back and pretend I was listening, I can almost play back in my head an echo of what he just said back to myself so I can respond to it. Like, what the fuck is all that shit? That's the kind of shit I feel like we should be really working on, trying to characterize and create a system that we could talk about it with. And neuroscience is totally doing this very much with the language of phenomenology, which is even more reason to stand. But yeah,
Well,
like
I
it's
just posted the book that I was talking about, and
awesome.
and that guy would very much consider himself part of neurophenomenology. So I think it would be
I
useful
stand.
for people to think about that if they look at the book.
I
But go
stand.
on, Bethany. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I was just about to like be mad at Elon Musk or something. Let's hear from someone else. Is Tiny Toad there? Tiny Toad is our book club ghost. She just pops up and is mysterious. She might just be listening or not at all.
Crying blood.
What about MJ? You still there? Or Jeremy?
I'm
Oh,
still here.
Tiny's just listening. Jeremy,
I'm
what
still
you
here.
thinking?
I saw once Michael said he posted a book. I went and tried to go find it. But yeah, I remember I was watching the video about spirituality. I know you started going on the rant about Musk and consciousness and stuff there. I was thinking like, yeah, I was thinking it made sense. Like conscious can sort of be thought of like the sixth sense, I guess, if you want to call it that, in a sense that and what you're talking about, like how you talk about hearing or seeing or something. You're talking about you can direct it as something. I was immediately thinking about I was reading, I haven't finished it yet, but I was reading Elbow Room by Daniel Dennett, and he was talking about, I think there was a part in there he was talking about with free will and stuff like that. It's sort of being like I don't know if he said it or if I just sort of made it this analogy to make it make sense to myself. Of it's sort of being like a faucet that you can sort of turn on and turn off. I kind of feel like that, or you can sort of like abrupt it or interrupt the flow. So I think that kind of analogy I think that kind of works for what you're saying about consciousness, but as far as like being able to focus it on one
Mm-hmm.
particular thing or not, I think it's pretty interesting because I know I haven't really thought about consciousness honestly until I started watching your videos.
But
Oh,
what
nice.
about the degree to which one thinks that they are conscious, they are intentionally uh, uh, projecting their consciousness through their will, and they are not. You know,
I
that's a big
I
part.
don't know. I don't know how
Yeah, like
any
Darwin, who was
individual
in
can
here.
think of. I don't know how any individual, like by themselves, can perceive that. I think that would have to be like an outside observation. I don't know if I could, like. There's a lot of auto delusion. I feel like would go into that unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
Well, what I'm simply trying to point out is much as quite similar to what Bethany was trying to point out about consciousness, which is that like you say Dennett, he makes this argument. Okay, I can observe a thing, and then if I use my mind in this particular way, then I start to acquire free will over it. And he's
Mhm.
assuming that what he does is free. He's assuming
Mhm.
that what he does is a degree of control at which he has freedom rather than some point on a continuum where he doesn't. Well, there's going to be at some point when one believes that they are past that point, but they are not, right? And when you think about free will or consciousness as this singular thing, as this entity, right? And I think this is a big thing that Hume gets at, because he says it very early on. He says, yeah, this certain type of philosopher, and that he's talking about the poetic philosopher, they look for these single principles, but really, it's more likely to be a bunch of interconnected faculties. And then he lists some off. And then when he goes to the next section, he lists off more ideas and principles and distinctions. But he never at any point says it is this or it isn't that. It's more him trying to get the best description to help expand our knowledge. And so
I think
I'm just problematizing what Dennett said.
I think that's what it'll probably break down, because I think Dennis starts off, and I think he even said it to Sam Harris on his podcast, is that this free speech, not free speech, so free will he's talking about is the kind of free will that matters, is the kind of the only free will that that matters, in the sense that we can, that's the one we think that we have, that's what we wake up, we assume that we, that you're going to get up, you're going to get coffee, or you're going to get tea, or whatever like that, whatever examples are given. You don't really think going to death where I only have this limited capacity, I only have this choice to do this because of this, that, and the other thing. I think it breaks down as far as a conversation we're having about just the idea of consciousness now, because it'll just end we have the kind of consciousness that matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I got excited. I was just giving some affirmation. No, because I was thinking as you were talking, I feel like it all boils down to, with both these arguments, and David Hume had much to say about both, ultimately, it's so trivial, A thing like free will, I think, is even more trivial than, pursuing this idea, this supposed idea that's completely assumed that consciousness could be this singular functioning entity that maybe could, exist outside of our bodies. Free will is the same exact thing. It's why, first of all, what even posits that free will is a thing, and a thing that we should desire? It's definitely I don't think it definitely doesn't stem from Christianity, because people were even the ancient Greek philosophers were talking about fucking free will. What's his name? Democritus or some bullshit. I don't know, I'll find his name. But Democritus, that's my dude. Yeah, he was talking about free will. Stop, Jack's making fun of me. Go away. Anyway, yeah, it definitely doesn't stem from Christianity, but Christianity, I feel really got people excited about free will too. This idea, oh my God, do I have it? Do I not have it? We're obsessed, but it's dude, of course it doesn't exist. It's trying to prove your own existence too. It's I can't, but this is all just a testament to the shortcomings of language. It's we literally invented the concept of a free will. If it doesn't work, then don't use it. Maybe we don't have it because this reveals a limitation and maybe a problem within language. Maybe we should change the language, because clearly it's not working. It doesn't have to work.
That's what is simply that by switching it to experimentation and switching things to mixture and trying to approach things for the betterment of life, that all of a sudden the focus of philosophy no longer becomes these big brain concepts. It's at the beginning he talks about virtue, and the arguments about virtue either in these abstract ways that are trying to find a structure, a single principle of virtue, or these poetic sort of popular arguments about virtue, neither of them in isolation gets us any closer to actually understanding how we should function in society or how we should function politically. It's only when we start to grasp them both in combination, both in mixture, that we start to get a good idea of how to approach morality, how to approach these ideas, and realize that those ideas are not one thing, but actually multiple things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant too, to go back to consciousness for a second, because I think too our biggest problem when discussing consciousness is also that the word, just like we were saying before with like God too, the word doesn't have a clearly defined meaning. So like even in our discussion tonight, I feel like every time we've used the word consciousness, we're just alluding each time to something totally vague and something else that doesn't necessarily look like how we just used it a second ago. It's not a
Hmm.
clearly defined word, like, because in many senses I think it almost like the word consciousness is also used as a way to describe the unified feeling of being perceptive of everything, and Jeremy, you were just saying like it could be kind of characterized as like a sixth sense, and I think that's true, but at the same time it's also used when we talk about it kind of as a word to describe the feeling of being of all my senses working together at the same time in unison. So I think
Hmm.
that's probably part of why people feel like it's the ultimate sense. Like it's got to
Yeah.
be magic, There's
Well,
something magic about it, but all of this is like definitely a byproduct of the language and its limitations we have in trying to talk about this shit. I think we need to create more language to, I think science definitely will as we go on trying to characterize consciousness. Who even knows if this will be a word or a concept that's really used in the future at all? I kind of think it won't be. I think it'll probably turn into a lot of tinier words, definitions, talking about this shit.
yeah, I definitely think I'm definitely with you as far as like the limitation of language goes. Kind of think of language as like a tool to express abstract thoughts, but they don't really do it that precisely, like they do it really, really well. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't, words don't really, I can't really express exactly everything that I'm thinking down to a fundamental level, especially when I'm talking about things that are like me specific, you know. It's like it gets to a point where there's sort of like a reaching out. I'm reaching out to the person I'm communicating to. They're reaching out to me, and there's a handshake that needs to happen. It doesn't always. Sorry, that doesn't always happen.
Well, that
Uh,
makes sense too, right? Because isn't that the very reason that language exists in the first place? It's a tool of
Mm-hmm.
communication, Like we didn't come up with it to talk to ourselves in our heads and think about fucking philosophy, It's a tool that we use to reach out, just like you said, It's to establish mutual agreement. But also, I think what you're saying, like, language doesn't, it can't perfectly capture or describe experience. I think it's also true that we should have faith in ourselves that maybe we can make it so that it does more perfectly describe experience because we already are doing this, like look at our language
Mm-hmm.
now compared to our language thousands of years ago. Like we are always coming up with more concepts and, within different languages, I think some are much more effective at doing these things, communicating more complex ideas. Like language is our invention, and I think where it's lacking, we can totally improve it, And I
Mm-hmm.
think that we should, instead of just resigning to this idea that, like, some things, there's no words, It's kind of
well,
like what we
Yeah,
were saying
yeah,
before with people who act like science can't know everything. It's like, well, then make it know everything, you
well,
know?
yeah.
to
That's
go
not, I
back,
want to say that's not what I wasn't getting at that at all. That we should just stop either. Like I think that we should just get. Language is constantly evolving and stuff, and we
Oh,
just need to
yeah, I
be,
wasn't
like you
saying
said,
you
we
were
need to
saying
be
that.
to,
malleable enough to like let it do that.
Totally.
I just
Power
want to
is
go
in
back.
us.
I want to go back to like quickly to two philosophers that we had talked that we touched on before the break, and what they said about the concept. When they were saying the concept, I think they were just saying the word, you know. And in both Leibniz and Spinoza, in Leibniz he says, you know, the monad or the concept is both singular and multiple, right? It's a multiplicity, it's a whole, but it's something that can be analyzed infinitely, and so it can be infinitely multiple. And Spinoza said the same thing. It's a mode or a concept is both singular and multiple. But instead of saying the mode was infinite, he said that the mode could consume something that was outside of it and form a new mode, right? And so, on both of them are indicating certain functions of language, the kind of fabulism or construction, that aspect of language, that we can both look at a word or a concept, and we can analyze it and find all these new details in what we already had, or we can combine it with another concept or idea and produce something that's absolutely new. And that this kind of formal function of language is something that we should always keep foregrounded. When people start to think about language as fixed, that's when you start to have really bad philosophy, because they're arguing that in the same way that you Bethany described the worst of religion as, you know, as something that is determinate and it absolutely has to be this way, and if it isn't that way, then you're wrong. Well, that's not exactly how language works.
Right. And I think this is a thing that philosophy has only really just started to critique seriously, you know, which is considering that a lot of the history of philosophy almost looks like this word worship, as Jean Ray would put it. The Time Cube guy. Do you guys like Time Cube?
I don't know.
Fuck yeah.
Thank you.
Time Cube is like retarded Wittgenstein. Time
uh,
Cube rules. He says that he talks a lot about word worship, and that's totally, I think, what a lot of philosophy is. You know, it's and I'm not like, you know, trying to be derogatory to anyone, because I don't think it's exactly that, but it is kind of a lot of philosophical arguments do seem very trivial, and people recognize this, and I think they're turned off by it. And people, like, you know, searching, like, what is virtue? How can I find it? It's like, dude, virtue is literally a word that you made up. Like, you tell me what virtue is. What do you mean, what is virtue? Like, you came up with it. How are you gonna
what's it
sit
mean to
here and
you?
ask that?
I boot.
Yeah, like, what? Virtue is whatever the fuck you tell me it is, and then we'll use that, and we'll go forward, you know? We can't sit here looking for the definition of a thing, and that's, like, this problem we've been talking about with free will and consciousness and everything. Everything is always assumed, and then we try to find it, and we're constantly failing to recognize that, like, these are all just decisions that we need to make together and agree on, and if we do agree, then we can use them to move forward, you know? Like arguing over what is morality, for example, is literally so trivial. Like, morality could be literally anything we agree for it to be, you know? It's not a thing that exists externally in the world. It's a word
And it
that
really,
describes an idea that we all have some sort of common reference point for. But if we want it to have a clearly a clear definition, then we simply just have to choose one, you know?
yeah, exactly.
You just got at something really quickly, when you said it's not something external in the world, which I think is kind of driven a lot of the ideas that the kind of problematic that has caused this way of thinking to extend for so long, which is that, you know, there's been this relationship between philosophy and other forms of knowledge and the world as this process of discovering this thing that's external to us and bringing it inside of us, rather than seeing the kind of internal external divide as something that's more continuous and more gray, and that is again, more of an admixture of various ideas and images and objects and parts of the brain and parts of matter, and that the separation of it into external world and internal world, consciousness and the universe, that these things obstruct our ability to think about it. They don't actually expand it. Like maybe in very specific cases, yes, in physics you need to think in third person perspective about the universe, or when you're writing a novel, you have to think in a first person perspective about me. But when you're talking about ideas in general, that you have to have more freedom than that.
Yeah. And I will say, though, speaking of morality real fast, I do actually, when I said it doesn't exist externally, I do think, though, that it is true that it describes a concept that speaks to things that exist externally, like empathy and the human pursuit of pleasure and what feels good. And I think a lot of what feels good naturally, like literally biologically, are things like, well, just like promoting your general well-being. And I feel like it is true, it's likely true that it's a function of our biology to like not want to be violent to other people, because it does that like aids in our own survival. And I think David Hume actually has like an entire argument for morality being a natural phenomena in many ways. I think he's like the first philosopher to really put this forward, and I need to read that. But yeah, I believe that a lot. But anyway, I think this has been going on for a while. I think that we should technically wrap it up, and we should still stay and talk, maybe. But I just want to technically wrap it up for anybody who might be listening on YouTube, so that maybe they can have a nice little conclusive ending here. So, thank you everyone for joining this discussion. Um, we're going to be reading Kant next. So I hope that you join us for that. And Kant, like Michael was saying earlier, is somebody that is responding directly to Hume and is very influenced by him, but also has some objections. So very excited to read Kant. And then I think from Kant we'll be going to Hegel, to Nietzsche, and then I think to Husserl, if I'm not missing anybody. So get excited. I'm going to tell Craig to leave, but we should all stay and keep hanging out. Welcome to all the newcomers. And like I said, too, if any of you are interested now, having joined us in going back and listening to some of our earlier materials, the last one would be a really good one to listen to. It's linked on our website, and it's basically just a summary of all we've read. So, yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. See you next time at Book Club, aka Speed Reading now is our new name. But Book Club is still so, it just sticks. See you next time.